Thanks for reading that. For the next little while, we're going to, this week and next week and the following week, we're going to unpack different aspects of that first chapter. And so, I guess for this morning, though, we're going to talk about tests. And the question that I have for you, as a professor for many years, and I still teach, so who here likes tests? Put up your hand. Who likes tests? No one. Seriously. Okay. So you all should. Oh, I see that hand back there. Good. Okay. Like sometimes with tests that, we should see tests as this opportunity to demonstrate all that we've learned, right? At least that's what I would say as a professor. And so I actually used to, a lot of times I would teach this or give this lecture sort of on academic skills and test-taking 101 to brand new college students, and where I would highlight some different strategies for taking tests. Like simple things like, well, if you're writing a test, if there's a question that you didn't really know, if you're not sure what it means, you just skip it and then continue on. Like you don't kind of get hung up on it and get anxious and freak out, but you just kind of go on. Other sort of strategies were make sure, this is a very basic one, but it can make a huge difference. Look at both sides of the piece of paper, because every once in a while someone will be done a test and they forget a question on the back side of the last page. So I would sort of do this and sort of highlight sort of some of the good strategies for taking tests. And realistically, another one that I like, and this is Calvin and Hobbes, he highlights this. Sometimes it's nice, so if you can read, it says, explain Newton's first law of motion in your own words. Okay? And I like this because he finds a loophole. Right? He goes on and yakka, food, mog, drugs, or whatever, and then, he puts it in his own words, not in English. Get it? Right? So, now, the thing about learning how to take tests, it's probably best to learn how to do that before you actually are taking a test, right? So there's some sense that where preparation is a good thing, like to be able to think about, what is the best strategy, and of course to prepare for a test, all that sort of stuff. So when you actually get to the test, you're ready. And this is sort of what James is doing here, right? That James is writing, and giving his test-taking 101, right? And it's very obvious that James was writing to a community that was experiencing variety of trials, right? Like they were a church that was being pushed in from all sides, was being persecuted, was being oppressed. A whole bunch of different issues comes up, and James is kind of telling them, step back a little bit and let's talk about these trials and tests that you're facing. And so, we see this throughout the book of James, right? And so I think part of it as we go through, we'll kind of keep coming back to some of this stuff in the first chapter because, it's very clear that they're facing some sort of economic trials, and that's something which comes up again and again, that they're having troubles controlling their tongue and all this. And so it all comes back to sort of how do we navigate these trials and tests that we face throughout life. And James is trying to provide a proper perspective that they should take on these various trials. Okay, and so and for us, of course, it applies too. That it's, well, how do we approach the various trials and tests that we face in our lives? Because we will face them. That's a given. And so now this chapter as a whole has four sort of sections. And so the first part talks about how to face tests with joy. Okay, and then he talks about wisdom and that we should, in the midst of these trials and tests, that we can ask God for wisdom and how to deal with them. And so we're going to talk more about that next week. And then he highlights in this first chapter, like in verses 9 to 11, that economic tests and how can we navigate them And that we'll talk about also in a future message. And then he ends coming back to the idea of tests. And then he broadens it and talks also about temptation in light of the goodness of God. And so really this morning, I realized as we were going through, there's so much material in this that we're really going to just focus on the first part of this. And then next week I'll kind of come back to the temptation part and the wisdom and how to approach it. So the very first thing is, how do we face tests? What does James say? Well, what he says we might not like, okay? Because he says we should consider trials occasions for joy. Right? Now, when I asked who liked tests, really no one put up their hands. Because tests are not things that we would initially associate with joy. Tests can be tough. They can be hard. They can be defeating, right, as we go through them. And here James is saying, well, no. He says, consider them occasions of joy. And he says in verse 2, consider it pure joy. He doesn't just say joy. He says pure joy. My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And so this sort of is very paradoxical. It's not the natural way we would think about facing tests. And I imagine that when this letter was read to the churches in the first century, they rolled their eyes, right? Or I don't know if ancient people rolled eyes, but they kind of said, "What? Seriously, James? How can we do this?" Because when we think of the trials and hardships that they were facing, sometimes they can make ours look pale in comparison. So he says, consider trials occasion for joy. And when he talks about joy, this is a Greek word that it means happy. Well, not happiness. It means joy. It means gladness. It's one that's really hard to understand from a Christian point of view. What does it really mean? Right? Because now the way the different translators will do, they'll talk like NIV will do pure joy. Right? That it's joy that's being perfected, that it's pure. It's, why New RSV will say nothing but joy. All joy, sheer joy, or, Eugene Peterson in his message talks about a sheer gift, playing off the meaning of the word for joy, that it can also mean gift in some contexts. So the challenge that we face is that, what is exactly joy? Well, it's not the same as happiness, right? It's not the same as happiness or cheerfulness, which, when I think of happiness or cheerfulness, that, if when the Packers win, I'm happy, right? So I've been happy for 2 weeks in a row, right? It's been great. And now tonight they're facing the New Orleans Saints, and I'm going to be happy again. Right? So that's based on sort of, something, the circumstances of them winning and defeating their opponents, right? That creates happiness. When, we're going to celebrate the birth of a baby in our congregation, and that's something to be celebrated. That's something that can give happiness or cheerfulness, right? So what joy, though, the difference is that the joy isn't based on our circumstances in the world, but rather it's grounded in our relationship with the risen Christ. Right? So it's deeper than that. It's deeper than just our reaction to our circumstances. Now, it can also be reaction to circumstances, but the thing is, when our circumstances kind of suck, that we can still have joy. And to me, that's the key of what James is talking about here. That it's paradoxically possible to experience this sort of joy despite our present trials and sufferings. Okay, that this is sort of a paradox. And we see this in the early church. That when you read through the book of Acts, when you read through Paul, that it seems that they sort of saw and they viewed suffering and the trials that they were having as occasions for joy because they were suffering like Christ suffered. That they knew also that there was more to it than just what is happening in the present. And so there's a number of passages where we see that it talks about, the joy that we can have. It's much like the same thing that Paul talks about, the peace that surpasses all understanding. that we can have as Christ followers, that it's not something that's tied to our external circumstances, but it's something that's deeper, that God through the Holy Spirit gives us in our hearts, and that we can face anything, in this world because Jesus Christ is with us. So, a couple things are important to keep in mind too, is that James isn't saying that they are joy. Right? He's not saying that the trials, the tests that we face are joy. But instead, he says, consider them as joy. And I think that's an important distinction, right? Because sometimes we shouldn't be going through life and just kind of, hey, this is great, I just got in an accident. Or hey, my cat just died, right? Yay. Right? No, it's like things happen in life which are sad, which are horrible, which are things that will, that it would be weird if we go around just smiling. It would be there'd be something wrong with us. But here James is saying that when we encounter these sorts of tests and trials, that we need to sort of view them as joy that takes us beyond the circumstances. And it's actually a command in the Greek. He doesn't really give us an option. He says, consider them, right? Consider them joy. And so part of it is that we need to look through our trials to their ultimate results. And right? So the thing is that we don't kind of keep focused on the trials that we're going through, the bad things that we're going through. We don't keep our head down, but rather we keep our head up. And we look through them to the joy that we know we will experience when Christ returns, and that's part of what he talks about in this passage, but also that we keep our head up in terms of, which is a good thing also if you're tackling someone in football, keep your head up, don't look down. Just a side note. But, we want to keep our head up and keep our sort of our focus on God and on Jesus through that. And so we can talk about both present joy. So it's, that I'm not saying that, we just have to think about when we get to the new heavens and new earth and we're with Jesus, and that can just keep us motivated through all the stuff that we go through. But no, it is that, right? It talks about our anticipated joy. But it's also that we can experience, through the Holy Spirit, some present joy, as long as we have the right perspective. So, now, he talks about tests. Now, the question is, what sort of tests is he talking about? It's this Greek word, periasmos. It actually can mean both external trials and tests, right? So, as a professor, I give you a test as a student. Where's Alicia? Oh, there she is. Yeah, okay. And I was her prof. I taught her, and I would give her a test. And so that's something that, that's something that comes from without, right? Like that's something that comes from the outside. The word also can mean internal temptations, right? And enticements to sin and disobey. So it's actually quite, and you see the word kind of shifting as we get to the later part of this chapter that we'll look at next week when it talks about temptations. Right? And so the word talks about both. But initially in the first part, he's talking more about external trials and tests. And he's also kind of talking about all sorts of tests. Right? Because, he says, when he talks, he says, consider, pure joy when you encounter tests of various kinds, of many kinds. And so he is trying to sort of give us a fairly comprehensive theology of test taking. And that includes these economic tests that come up again and again in the letter. So, what does he say about tests? Why does he say that we can consider them joy? Well, he provides 3 reasons. Okay, and the first one is they produce perseverance. right? So that's sort of the, as he's looking out and he's saying, well, what can these tests produce in our lives? The first thing he sees would say that they can produce perseverance in our lives, right? And so he says this in verse 3, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. So, like James realizes he's not saying anything new or radical, that they hadn't heard this before. He's just reminding them, because you already know this, right? You know that for almost anything good, for us to be good at anything, it takes hard work. It takes perseverance. You're not going to, no matter what you think when you're playing rock band, or people still play rock band, that Wii game, anything like that. Like you think that, you could just master the guitar. Well, you put a real guitar in your hands and you can't, right? It takes practice. Same thing with sports. Same thing with any sort of thing that's worthwhile to do in life. It takes practice. And that's why Isaac is far better than our first two kids, because we didn't know what we were doing with our first. No, I'm just joking. Sydney, if you're watching this, I'm sorry, okay? Thanks. But so, perseverance. And so perseverance is, now when we talk about that, it is the capacity to continue to bear up under difficult circumstances. It's the, like suck it up sort of mentality, that you just kind of, you continue to bear up and you continue to push forward, even though circumstances are tough. It's more than just patience. Like the King James Version translated as patience, which, I kind of, like it's a little bit too soft, but rather it's patience with an attitude, right? That it's, and I like the translations of endurance or fortitude, right? Fortitude, it just sounds like you suck in your gut when you say it, right? Fortitude or steadfastness. Or we talk about resilience, right? And resilience is a good word too, because it assumes that resilience isn't something, it takes into fact that sometimes you fail. Sometimes you don't, consider things all joy, right? And the resilience is getting yourself back up. So yesterday I went for a bike ride, and I went kind of way to Rundle Park, and as I was riding, I didn't really, now not from here, okay? I was driving, and I'm not crazy, but so I went there, and it just so happened that the Wildcats were practicing. That's a junior football team in Edmonton. Now their season has been canceled, right? And so, but they're still getting together for practice, and and I just happened to be there, kind of as they were finishing up. And I ran into a couple of the players that I've coached. And, this one player, I've coached him since he was probably 7 years old. All the way through Mustangs and then at Scona. And I'm just, surprised that he's playing for the Wildcats, because he was the kid who, in a tackling drill or in a blocking drill, he would get knocked down. But then he would get back up. And he would get knocked down again. And he'd get back up. And sort of the fact that he's playing now for the Wildcats, is just a testimony to this idea of perseverance. Right? It's not that he was able to master it and do great the first time he stepped onto the football field, but that he persevered. I can think of no other football player that I've coached that showed the same amount of perseverance than he did. Right? And it's just amazing to think that he kept at it. And so it's this grit. We've talked about Angela Duckworth before when we were going through Hebrews, right? And this grit, that it's passion, that you really, passion plus perseverance is grit. And it's this idea of when you fail, when you get back up, and you continue to go, right? That is what James is talking about, when he talks about perseverance. And this perseverance is a result of testing, right? That it's, it's a testing of our faith. And the word that's used here is one that is used in metallurgy, right? It's this idea of purifying, right? And when you take gold or when you take silver and you want to purify it and get rid of all the dross and all the other junk, it's like the idea of the refiner's fire that we read about in passages in the Old Testament. You know, that these tests that we face will produce perseverance or endurance or fortitude in our lives. And one of the things is that it's really only testing that will produce it. That we can't bypass that. You know, a lot of times when you're sitting there as and watching football or watching musical production or a concert or orchestra, we think, oh man, wouldn't it be great to just play like that? You know, and you think that you can just kind of go in there and start playing, and you imagine in your head, as every single football fan thinks, as they think they know better than everyone else, right? Oh, I would have made that tackle. No, you wouldn't have. You wouldn't have even been close, right? Because these guys practice again and again and again and again and again, right? And that's what it is, and it's this refining process. And life is like that. Like we have, our lives are characterized by test after test after test. And it's when we continue to get back up and to try again, to work harder, all this sort of stuff, that's where God can use and change us. People don't become prayer warriors because they prayed, once a week. It's because they've been on their knees praying every day. And we can apply it. So it just doesn't have to be sports. It applies to everything across the board. Now, the second reason, that perseverance isn't the goal for James. It isn't the end of that's looking here. And then he raises his head a little bit higher and he looks a little bit further out. And he says that, and then we know that perseverance then leads to maturity. That's sort of our goal. And he says in verse 1:4, let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. And right, perseverance isn't an end, right? But it's maturity. It's the ability to sort of face anything, to have this sort of stable righteousness, this stable walk with God, where you'll still have struggles and you'll still face things, but maybe, because you've been experienced in some of these other things before, that you won't sort of fall as hard. And so these trials perfect the believer, and he talks about perfection. We'll talk more about this later, but not in the sense that we become sinless. Like that's never really in view for James or anyone else in the New Testament. We only will become perfect when we see Christ face to face and that we're fully transformed into his image. In the here and now, in this life, that'll always be sort of almost. Like we'll keep working on it as we pilgrimage, as we follow Christ, and hopefully it will continue to grow throughout this life. But that there's this drive to a mature, a complete faith that's lacking in nothing. And I think it's important to keep in mind, too, that maturity isn't like perseverance in that it's not really a virtue, but it's a whole bunch of virtues together, right? That it's like love and faith, that it's all these things together, and it's the product of these ongoing acts of obedience to God, right? So there's this sense that as we are obedient, as we do something, good, right? That sort of, continues to build us for the future. And that we're continued through the Spirit, as we cooperate with God, to be transformed into the image of his Son. And that's something that's an ongoing process for all of us. Now, later in verse 12, James gives a third benefit of testing. The third reason why we should consider them joy, and that's where he takes his eye up, and now he looks at the furthest goal. And he says it's for future blessedness, right? He says in verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, the person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And so here the goal ultimately is to pass the test, right? To cross the finish line, to obtain that crown of life, which probably just means eternal life, right? That it talks about it's a crown that's made up of life with God, right? And that it has this idea of salvation, that's our ultimate goal. Now, this same emphasis is found later in chapter 5, where he also talks about patience and perseverance. And in that context, he talks about how we are to endure these hardships and suffering and trials as Christ followers with patience and perseverance in the face of the coming of the Lord. Because we know that Christ is going to return. And we know that all things will be made all right when Christ returns, and that we will be transformed, and that we will finish the race. And so notice here that it's with facing tests that he looks down at the median and the perseverance. And then he looks at the maturity that it can form, and then he looks to the distance and this idea of the crown of life, that our ultimate goal. So the three reasons that he considers, that why we should consider them joy, are the development of perseverance, right? Which leads to maturity, and then talks about future blessedness, right? When you train, probably one of the toughest thing, I'm going to talk about football a lot today. One of the toughest things, with football and talking to, a couple of these players yesterday, is that the toughest thing for them that there's no games, right? They're just practicing. And while any football player will say that, yeah, practice is important, and it's actually more important. You practice far more in football than you play. But you still want to play, right? And so, it's this sense that if we just sort of stop at perseverance, we're not sort of, we'll never be satisfied with that. If we stop at maturity, but ultimately we want to finish the race. And so we need to keep our eyes on all three targets. And what's interesting here is that this also balances discipleship and character formation, spiritual formation, these sorts of things, in the here and now, with the anticipation of future realities. Right? Sometimes I know that previous generations sometimes have been criticized as being so heavenly minded that they're useless in this life. Well, no, it's not that. It's both and. Right? That we need to, allow ourselves to be transformed so that we grow in our love for God and for one another and for our neighbors. But ultimately we know that we'll only fully get there when Jesus returns. So that's kind of how, what James, Test-Taking 101, that's what he highlights. Now, so conclusions, I have three things and then one caveat. So one is that it's important to have the right perspective. And I hope I'm not sounding like, so that I'm just trying to sell you on the latest fad and the power of positive thinking or any other junk like that. Because it's not that our perspective, the treating them as joy, as opportunities for joy and occasions for joy, is not just based on that you think hard and you try to be positive, but it's based on the reality that Jesus Christ died for us, that he rose from the dead, and as the first fruits of a resurrection, that he is returning. So it's based on our faith, and our faith is certain. But, we need to sort of keep in mind the perspective. And it's good to sort of spend some time thinking about it when things are going all right in our lives. Because then when things go south, then we maybe have the right approach to sort of handle them. The other thing is prayer. And here we're going to talk more about this next Sunday. But, what Paul says, or what James says, when you're going through these trials, he says, ask God for wisdom. right? That in this wisdom, and it's not just sort of divorced from this whole context, but it's wisdom for undergoing and understanding how we can get through these trials and tests. And what he says is that our God is a generous God, and he will give without reservation. And then persevere with joy. We need to develop a resilience in our faith. COVID has been tough. Right? Do I dare ask you, or do I dare put that in this? Consider COVID joy. No, COVID sucks. Right? It's tough. It's just something, and it's been going on, and it's going to continue to go on for a long time. But I think James would say that, let's keep the goal in mind, that it is tough. But you know what? There's some good things that we can take from this time. Right? Like one thing I've noticed, like even yesterday when I was out for the bike ride, like the number of people outside enjoying the parks and nature in Edmonton. And I know that we've all done more walking than many other times, right? And so there's lots of, and not just little things like that, but I think prayer has been something that has been significant in my own life during this time, right? And so it's something where, part of it, and sometimes, we have bad days. And then that's where the caveat comes in, is that, like James is talking about, okay, this is our game plan. This is what we hope will happen. But we also know there's many times when we don't realize that game plan, where we don't consider stuff joy, where it's tough, and where it's something that just undoes us, right? And the thing to keep in mind in those cases is that we have a loving, grace-filled, generous God, right? Who, when we fail, when we fall, when we stumble, he's the first one there to help us up. And even more than that, that he will provide a way out for us. And he will be there through the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives to help us, so we can face these tests and trials with joy. Now, just before the worship team comes up to lead us in another song, I do just want to highlight the resources again for this study. So there's a study guide that's available on the website under sermons. And there's also now, we've added a family section to it. And so there's a couple questions that relate to what Joella was sharing. And so that way, if you are watching this at home with your family, or even if you're just looking at the kids feature, that you can go and do that. And I just want to remind you as well, the group study, we started off last week, Wednesday, 7 o'clock. We meet here in the sanctuary, nicely spread out, and then on Zoom at 2:30. And so I encourage you this fall that as we sort of study the book of James, that let's all really dig deeper in this book and spend time in it, that we may allow God to transform us through the words of James. Amen.
Let's stand up together. This is a song a lot of us